welcome everybody, and thanks for coming along this evening. So my name is David Osmond. I'm the president of the New South Wales branch of the Economic Society of Australia, the newly elected president actually. So we're just thinking from the society about what we want to do to service you, the members, or for what many of you who are the members. So please let me know, and I do appreciate the comments that have come back already. In the context of my role, let me also welcome Catherine de Fontaine, who's the president for the national president of the Economic Society of Australia. It's fantastic to have emeritus. Emeritus, yes, but nonetheless, you've done that role for a long time. You kind of always stay as president. We're going to kind of question whether we move to the American system, where once you've held a role, you hold it forever, rather than the British system where you become emeritus and then step down. Who knows? We'll wait and see from there. Anyway. So before I start, I just want to acknowledge that we here in Sydney, for the people who are here in Sydney, are on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional people who are on this land, and we pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and of course to emerging as well. So for those of you who are avid readers of The Economist, you would have seen that last week's Economist talked all about where are all the geniuses. Now, of course, if you want to be a bit facetious, you could say, well, they're obviously in this room, especially now that we have our speaker, Ufuk, coming along with us. But if you want to take that prize, you've got to then move to the next question that The Economist was asking and saying, why are the geniuses doing such a bad job these days relative to what they were doing? So if you want to join that club, you've got to join the onus of actually saying why you're doing a pretty poor job. And they were pointing to things like declining productivity and so forth. One of the issues that they were raising there is that very talented people are just poorly allocated in the way the economy goes, and a bunch of stuff also about competition issues. Well, those issues, the interaction between incentives, innovation, and productivity, and in fact inequality, are what our very distinguished speaker is here today to talk about us. Ufuk, thank you most kindly for joining us here in Australia, but also particularly here tonight to talk with us about exactly those issues and what we can learn from the extensive research that he's done. Now, Ufuk, as you've already seen from what we sent out beforehand, is the Harburger Professor of Economics at the University of Chicago. He's also a member on a huge number of different growth boards and so forth, a fellow of Brookings, member of NBER, and so on and so forth. And we'll be here for a very long time if we go through all of the interactions. But the important thing is that they all have a very common theme. They're all this question around how we put that interaction of those four aspects together, which I think makes it so exciting as part of this collective problem that we all face, which is why is productivity slowed so poorly. And of course, if productivity is slowed so poorly, there's no basis for increases in real wages. And if there's no basis for increases in real wages, we just get grumbling from everyone out there. And so that, of course, I think is a huge part of the discontent that has happened across particularly advanced economies in the world. And so it's a really, really important topic. We're hoping we're going to get full enlightenment in the next hour or so. The way this is going to work for those online is Ufuk will give his speech. I hope we will end up with 15, 20 minutes or so of Q&A. I will be able to see the online questions that come in. So please, if you are online, just send them along, and then we'll try and pick and choose from questions, but I suspect there'll be quite a few. The floor is yours.
All right, so thank you so much for having me. It's been a fantastic visit, and I'm already looking forward to coming back very soon for even an extended period, even more extended. So today I'm going to talk about the productivity puzzle and talent misallocation. So the title is already self-explanatory, but I will unpack what I mean by this in more detail for the next 30 to 35 minutes. So we care about economic growth. And when it comes to economic growth, of course, there are different ways of growing. One way of growing would be, for instance, spending a lot of the taxpayers' money to subsidize firms to hire more workers. And in that case, we can artificially boost job growth by simply making it cheaper for firms to hire. And that's easy. But as I'm going to show you and give you also more in more detail, these type of policies are typically short-lived. And then, the more, long-lasting way of growing, which we also refer to as quality growth, is more productivity-driven. And that's much harder. And that's why, today I would like to approach this problem of low productivity growth from microdata. And looking at the microdata, I would like to understand where we fail and what the bottlenecks might be, and then try to aggregate things up so that we can come up with more credible policy recommendations at the macro level. So before I go into details, of course, I need to give you a framework to think about this issue. And the framework is illustrated on the screen here. First, the societies or any economy consists of many talents. And of course, individuals, when they are born, when they come to schooling age, they are heterogeneous in terms of their ability. Some kids are very talented, some are less, some are even less talented. So we have this full heterogeneity. Not everybody is born to be a basketball player, not everybody is born to be an artist, not everybody is born to be an entrepreneur, and not everybody is born to be an inventor. So at the end of the day, quality innovation, quality growth will come from productivity, and productivity will come from better technologies, better practices, management practices, and improved efficiency. But these things will come from talented people or trained people. So the question is, once we have this initial talent pool, whom do we send to schools? Because clearly we are not educating everybody, right? I wish we had the resources to do that, but no society has that resource. So then, based on how our allocation system works, for instance, some countries like Australia also has the centralized entrance exam. Some countries have application systems. Some countries are just sending the kids directly to the schools in their neighborhood, in which case, rich neighborhoods have better schools on average. And as a result, you're basically, making the social mobility much harder because people are just living in where they are born, and they are stuck with those resources, public resources. So whatever the system may be, we are taking a subset of these talents and send them to schools. And here, I want to pay particular attention to technical training because, of course, the past literature has focused on the average years of schooling, and the literature has shown that average years of schooling correlates with growth, but there are different shades of growth and there are different shades of education. And the type of education that's needed is very different depending on what stage the economy is going through. For instance, very low income countries, when they are in the very beginning of their journey, there they need even the basic infrastructure, they need even the basic literacy. And there, having horizontal education policies would work well. But as the countries are advancing, when they come to the second phase, just investment in infrastructure is not sufficient. You can build roads, more buildings, more roads, more buildings, but then you will run into diminishing returns. Now we need to start thinking about what we are doing inside those buildings. We need to start thinking about efficiency and productivity and innovation. And that's exactly where the second phase comes in. Now, how are we going to boost the productivity? Well, in that second phase, what matters is, should we, for instance, think about a country that's growing from the very beginning, and they come to a certain maturity level, or at least they have the basic infrastructure. Can we immediately start asking them to compete with the US, France, or Japan? Clearly not. They don't have the capability yet. Yes, they have the infrastructure, but they don't have the knowledge. They don't have the capability. And there, we need to start thinking about how to build the sophistication in those economies. Let me also highlight one more thing, which is GDP per capita is not equal to the level of sophistication. There can be rich countries, like Saudis, for instance, resource rich. That's why GDP per capita is very high. But when you look at the complexity of their production, is extremely limited. Whereas, we have lower income compared to Saudi Arabia, for instance. We have lower income countries where the complexity is higher. So that's why, the sophistication, production sophistication or technological sophistication does contribute to income, but high income does not necessarily imply technological sophistication. So that's why when we think about quality growth, we need to focus on the complexity of these economies. Okay, and I think Australia is also an interesting case in that regard. I don't, when we look at the numbers, the level of income per capita doesn't match the level of sophistication that we, typically see across countries. So that's why I think it's an interesting discussion. Anyway, so now when we have these human capital, graduating from schools, depending on the job opportunities in the country, if, for instance, people are getting very, sophisticated PhD education in universities, then they join the labor market, but there's no demand for them. Companies are not sophisticated enough. There's no demand for PhDs. They think it's luxury for them. It's too expensive. What will happen? In that case, they will leave the country. Many countries are suffering from that problem. And then, of course, depending on the local conditions or depending on the programs that the country is preparing for diaspora or even for, foreign talents, some of them can generate reverse brain drain and come back to the country. So whatever those policies are, then, we create a certain talent pool, and then depending on the incentive mechanisms that we are creating, new entrants are introducing new technologies, incumbents are trying to compete with other incumbents, and then somehow we produce new technologies and then value it, and then this is generating the income through, technological progress. Now, when we want to understand this ecosystem, just focusing on the firms will not be sufficient. Even on the firm side, there's very different type of behavior, but just focusing on firm side won't be sufficient. We have to also understand, who is, how we allocate talents in the economy into different positions. So we need to take a holistic approach. Unless you have good players, your team can never win the championship, right? So just like that, you need to have strong, good human capital. Otherwise, no matter how much money we are dumping on the companies, if they don't have access to good, high quality engineers, inventors, or technical people, then they won't be able to deliver. So that's why, if you want to understand the bottlenecks in the society, we have to understand this whole ecosystem. So now, I've done quite a bit of work with colleagues on this line of work. We are working very closely with the World Bank and World Bank's 2024 World Development Report was focusing specifically on these issues, basically. Why do countries get stuck in a certain income level or in a certain level of sophistication? The problem typically that we observe is that, the policies that used to work in the past do not necessarily work in the future, because certain policies are bringing countries to a certain level, but to move forward, policies have to also be dynamic and changing. For instance, to build infrastructure, maybe more centralized governments can have a comparative advantage in putting the resources together. So that's why governments that have control over resources might be good in building infrastructure. But once those infrastructures are built, inside those buildings, we need new ideas. And new ideas will not come by a group of people who are running the government, right? We need a lot of people experimenting new ideas. Entrepreneurship becomes very, very critical in the second phase. And that's exactly where more authoritative governments starts to fail big time. Indeed, history is full of those. And so we are talking about those issues in great detail in this report. And then recently also with John Van Reenen from London School of Economics, we recently published a book on economics of creative destruction, which is again full of interesting studies that are all speaking to these issues in case you're interested. So now, before I go into more details, let's talk about a simple, success story that everybody loves to talk about, which is the Korean case. Korea, of course, before 1960, it was a very, very poor country, but there has been a Korean miracle, right? And when we look at the growth rate in Korea over time, so these are showing the aggregate growth in that economy, and we are decomposing that growth into three components. First, the contribution of capital. Second, the contribution of labor, and then the contribution of efficiency. And what's really, really important is that, yes, it's easy to put in place capital, it's easy to contribute through labor, but it's very difficult to contribute through productivity. But Korea managed to unlock that treasure, and they managed to sustain this efficiency growth for a long period of time. Indeed, what's really hard, I don't know how much you like basketball, but I'm a, Chicago Bulls fan, obviously. And, Michael Jordan's a key feature was that when he was jumping, he was able to stay in the air for quite a long time. Okay, that was his signature. And for economies, it's like this, when they start growing their productivity, they need to remain and sustain that productivity growth for a long time. Otherwise, back and forth doesn't work very well. So that's why, in Korean case, they manage that. Let's look at the Australian case. So in the case of Australia, it's not so much Michael Jordan, but but still, there is I think not one step forward, one step backward, but rather it's two step forward, one step backward. Okay. And I think there is some room for improvement here when we look at the aggregate data and to understand where the efficiency and this productivity growth is failing to remain in a sustainable way. On the positive side, I think it's really important to look at the micro data and understand, do an MRI scan on the economy. The way when we go to the doctor, of course, they do the MRI scans and they do the blood tests and just like this, because I really like to think about an economy just like a human body, right? At the aggregate level, we might see that there are some problems. Maybe we are having fever, which might correspond to low growth, but the same observation, same fever might be driven by different causes. So that's why it's really important to go to the micro level to understand where the bottlenecks are. So I think it's really important to first recognize the fact that it's not a magical abstraction. This productivity is not a magical abstraction. Aggregate productivity is nothing but the summation of individual productivities. I mean, look around these buildings. There are many, many companies that surrounding us, and whatever their productivity is, the weighted sum, for instance, I will tell you more about what I mean by this weighted sum, is whatever, their productivity is, that determines the productivity of the Australian economy. In sum, so if we think about the aggregate productivity, it's productivity of the individual firms, but then depending on how their market share is, for instance, whichever are, the larger firms will dominate more the aggregate numbers. Okay, maybe, the largest firm is the least productive firm. In that case, of course, the aggregate productivity will also turn out to be low. Right? So I think the important part there is, and when we look at the data repeatedly, what we see is the following. The secret sauce of the successful economies is not to keep all the firms at the same size, but rather letting the productive firms to expand and unproductive firms shrink in size and even shut down. And this resource reallocation and this transition by simply, generating the so-called creative destruction in the economy, the successful economies are reallocating resources towards more productive firms. There is some obsession, by the way, when it comes to policymaking, or when it comes to typically evaluating the health of an economy, there's this mistake of associating success of an economy with the size of the firms. Typically in developing countries, firm size is very small, whereas in advanced economies, firm size is really large. And then the typical argument is that, oh, what? Here's an indication that developing countries, emerging economies are doing really poorly because look at the firm size. And the health can be measured by looking at the large firms. So as a result, these firms should grow. It's not the firm size. If the goal was really to generate large firms, planned economies had the largest firms. So we know how to make firms grow, right? So it's not the firm growth or firm size so of course it's firm growth, but it matters which firms we are growing, right? So that's why this one-sided approach, just looking at the sheer firm size, is not the way to go. We have to look in a two-dimensional spectrum and see if productivity is associated with firm size or not. So there has to be a link between productivity and firm size. So how will that happen? It's very simple. Of course, we are living in a dynamic world, meaning that every day things are changing. So some firms are coming up with new innovations. Some firms are failing with their innovation attempts. Some firms are improving their productivity. Some firms are losing ground because, for instance, they have a very creative owner, and then the owner dies at some point, and then the firm loses its efficiency, for instance. So there can be many reasons why productivity at the firm level can go up or down. The critical thing there is, in healthy economies, those firms that are experiencing a positive productivity shock should hire more workers, and those firms that are experiencing a negative productivity shock should reduce their size. This is extremely important. But it's very simple to measure for us. It means that we are just going to look at the relationship between hiring and productivity changes at the firm level. Let's look at the data. Which firms have improved their productivity relative to the previous year? And let's look at the firms which created more jobs. Are they matching or not? And that relationship is summarized by the simple equation. Firm growth in terms of labor is on the left-hand side. Productivity growth is on the right-hand side. We like to call it some fancy words. Shock is nothing but the productivity growth, basically, okay? So this beta coefficient has to be positive. The higher is beta, the healthier is the resource reallocation. Look at the data. US has the most responsive firms. This is what we also call responsiveness to productivity shocks. US firms, thanks to their more liquid labor market, hiring and firing is easier. And as a result, the firms are responding much more to productivity shock. West Germany, which is very, very representative of the European economy, is half of the US level. So you can already see that if there's this large difference between the two economies in terms of their responsiveness, resource allocation will be much less efficient in Germany than in the US. I mean, we don't need to look anywhere else. Even this regression, this analysis here is already giving us the answer. But then, we were talking with Catherine earlier this morning, sometimes, their policy making is, of course, important because there are many, many efficiencies in the economy. Not everything is efficient. But then we have to have really informed policy making, right? Sometimes governments can also overdo the intervention. And in that case, in some governments, the government's trying to control the economy so much that they want to dictate what firms should do in the economy. And the most extreme of it was the planned economies. So in planned economies, where we also, so my data uses a lot of the my research uses a lot of micro data on firms, all sorts of firms. We have also a lot of studies that looked at early 19th century. We digitized historical patent records since 1836, trying to understand the innovation pattern from the golden age of the US economy. We managed to get access to Soviet Russia archives from 1970s and 80s. We digitized them to see how planned economies worked or failed. We know that it failed, but why did they fail? How did they fail? I think there's also a lot to be learned from there. And also, of course, from modern data. And look at the responsiveness in planned economies. There wasn't any, right? So As a result, productivity is not a magic number. It's just an aggregation, and at the micro level, things were not working. So we want normally this positive relationship between productivity and firm size in healthy economies. But when we look at the correlation between the two, it's significantly higher in the US compared to Germany, compared to planned economies. So this means that resources are not allocated efficiently in Germany, in West Germany, and in planned economies, it was completely inefficient, basically. So what I try to highlight, and let me revisit this idea of creative destruction, in a healthy economy, there has to be this balance between three forces. There will be new entrepreneurs coming up with new creative ideas, or they will come up with some ideas. Sometimes those ideas won't necessarily be good, but at least they will come up with some new ideas and they will enter the market. Through competition, we are going to eliminate the bad ones and the good ones will survive, and we will preserve some of them. But we have to feel comfortable saying goodbye to those firms that are not working efficiently. And this is the destruction force. So creation, preservation, destruction, unless we have this, balance between them, among them, we will fail. And most of the time, policymakers, or in general, we tend to stress about businesses shutting down. And that's why, there's a lot of, and for instance, of course, I need to be a little bit careful because, sometimes people can also misunderstand it. But so there might be overemphasis on small and micro businesses. And, thinking that they need resources, they are small because they need resources. And then, policymakers tend to create a lot of programs to help SMEs. Yes, many SMEs are resource constrained, but not all SMEs will create magic in the economy, right? Take two businesses. Both of them have two employees. One of them is 60 years old. The other one is 6 months old. Which one is more promising? Of course, the younger is more promising, because if a business is 60 years old, it means that it's just a mom and pop store that just survives in some neighborhood. But normally, there has to be a reason why we are intervening. Otherwise, the markets are already there's already market competition. There has to be a reason why we are using taxpayers' money to keep certain firms alive. And firms, typically, unproductive firms have to shrink, and at some point they have to shut down. And sometimes they are small because they are inefficient. And unless we let them leave, there won't be any new room for new firm creation. So they will crowd out new firm creation. So that's why I think it is important to also feel comfortable about this turnover. Otherwise, the force of creative destruction will not lead to productivity growth. So let me show you some interesting results on this. And as I said, there can be two different types of growth. One of them is this artificial or induced growth, where we use the taxpayers' money to save a lot of the troubled firms, or we subsidize firms to hire more workers, or sometimes we can even punish firms for not hiring. And indeed, let me show you some interesting example from the latter one, because the former one you're much more familiar, but the latter one is also quite common. And that's typically happening during privatizations. And let me take you back in history a little bit. And for instance, in early 90s, and this is really the extreme, and I think it really showcases how this type of mistake is made. So in early 90s, of course, there was a wall between East and West Germany, and then, the wall came down, and East German firms were very, very unproductive. Indeed, when I interviewed a lot of people, including auditors at the time, who audited the East German firms, quote unquote, one person especially mentioned that they were just a collection of garbage, basically. It was really, really bad. But of course, there were a lot of people working in those companies and they were losing their job. And this created some social pressure and social unrest. And there was a lot of demonstration. We are talking about 15,000 firms that were coming out of the East German economy. And there was a privatization agency called Treuhand. And this poor agency had only 200 agents to deal with 15,000 cases. You can imagine the mess, obviously. And, it was such a chaos that the head of the privatization agency got assassinated on April 1st, 1991, and he died. And then, after that incident, the agency also panics and suddenly changes its strategy of privatizing the firms. So these are the contracts that they were issuing when they were privatizing companies. And initially, these red bars are showing you those contracts where there was a proper due diligence, identifying the right price, and then that's how they were selling the company. But after the assassination took place, right at this dashed line, from that point onward, what they did is they stopped asking for a price, but instead they start asking for a labor commitment. So I would say, Elvira, buy this company. What you have to do is next time I come, you have to have 10,000 workers in it. Okay, that's the requirement. So think about what's happening. We are talking about a lot of inefficient firms, but because of the panic, now those firms are forced with a stick to keep workers in them. And if they failed to meet those targets, the government would impose a very significant fine per each worker that they failed to meet. Okay, so as a result, what happened is now, let's say I have a company that's, has 1,000 workers initially, but the government asked me to have 2,000 workers in it. Okay? It means that my initial size relative to the target size is 50%. Okay, so here I'm showing you the ratio of the initial size relative to the target size. If it's 1, it means I'm already at the target right from the beginning. If I'm to the left, I'm already short. And unless I grow my company, I will have to pay a fine. Look at the job creation. It's beautiful, right? 30% job creation is a fantastic number, And as you can tell, if they were already beyond the target, they downsized because they really needed to downsize. But if they were to the left, to avoid punishment, they were growing their size. This is how stick works. But subsidy works exactly the same way. If you say that, whenever you hire a worker, I'm going to give you a tax reduction per each worker, or I'm going to give you some subsidy, it will work the same way because you're effectively making it cheaper to hire a worker, or you can punish for not hiring. It's the same thing effectively. Okay? And that's what I mean by induced growth, induced job creation. It's not as opposed to organic job creation, okay? So what happened? Is this good news? No, because so this shaded area is showing you the duration of the contract. It's a normalized way, so you can assume that the contracts here were lasting for 2 years. Look at the red dashed line. So this is the job creation patterns. During the contract period, the firms were creating jobs. As soon as the contract was over, the number of jobs was just coming down, basically. Why? Because effectively the government was just creating policy edict firms. As soon as you pull back the policy, everything was just going back to where it's supposed to be. An alternative strategy would have been, rather than just focusing so much on the short-term job creation, a more organic way of creating jobs would have been to focus on their technological underpinning, on their productivity. Yes, it would have been a slow-moving process, but that would have been closer to the Korean example. Because in the case of Korea, in early 1960, Korean economy didn't have the capability. It wasn't sophisticated. The infamous Samsung at the time was just a noodle company, okay? But what the government did is when they wanted to build the sophistication in the economy, rather than just giving subsidy to hire more workers, the government subsidized company to build connections with foreign companies. Okay, and a lot of the Samsung people were sent to Japan and the US, and the government also subsidized technology licensing. It's not R&D, it's technology licensing, so that the Korean firms can learn from this and then build their sophistication. If the German government had also followed that path, yes, in the short run, it would have been more painful potentially, but in the long run, the technology would have improved much more significantly. And when we look at the data, indeed, the German government spent a ton of money at the time. So this is showing you the manufacturing subsidies per employee in 90s. Look at the European countries versus, the East Germany. They were just breaking records in terms of how much money they were spending per worker. What's been the outcome? Well, let's roll the movie forward for 30 years. 30 years later, this is income per capita across different cities. I mean, you can still draw the border between East and West Germany. Let's look at the technology creation, patenting. Even worse. Like, it's literally 30 years later, it's extremely visible, the divide between East and West Germany. Why? Because the policies were effectively kicking the can down the street, and rather than, swallowing the bitter pill, which Polish firms had to do, indeed, Polish economy was on the cover of the Economist magazine a couple of months ago, and the prediction is that the Polish economy will surpass the UK economy by 2030. So how did this happen? Well, the Polish transition was much more painful initially. There was the shock therapy, and the government didn't have the money to support firms. And then they said, whoever will survive will survive. We won't be able to save you. So as a result, there has been a very strong selection early on. Whereas for East Germany, it had a rich sibling, which is the West Germany, that came and threw a lot of money at the companies and made them survive. And this creative destruction, those three forces didn't take place. Okay, and as a result, the can was just kicked down the street. And here we see 30 years later, no matter how you slice the data, in all indicators, you see this divide. What about the organic growth? So, okay, this is, I think the induced growth is clear. How are we going to generate organic growth? Well, to think about organic growth, I think we need to first understand the people who are going to generate new technologies. First, these new technologies will come from inventors, but those inventors have to be hired by some entrepreneurs who are in these buildings. So I think the main question that we need to ask is, who are behind those technologies, and how can we have more of those creative people in the society? So for this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use some fantastic data from Nordic countries and look at the backgrounds of inventors and entrepreneurs. So let me just first focus on the question of who becomes an inventor. In a healthy economy, who becomes an inventor? And it's fascinating, when you have the right data, you can ask really very interesting questions. And, in the case of Denmark, we collaborated with the Danish Science and Technology Ministry, and they have fantastic data on firms and workers. But then we asked them if they would contact the military and get the IQ test scores. Because, all the males, at the age of 20, they have to go and take an IQ test, and then they spend a couple of weeks in the army to get trained, and we have their test scores. And now we can see the downside is, of course, this is just the males, but the upside is that at least for all the males in Denmark, we are able to see who does what. And what we see here is that when we look at the IQ deciles, the higher is the IQ, the more likely that an individual will be involved in some innovative activities. Okay, so this is a fantastic result, in terms of talent allocation. Now, these are inventors or R&D workers. But some people should hire these people, right? So who is going to hire them? Entrepreneurs. Then the question is, in this economy, who becomes an entrepreneur? What is the relationship between IQ and the likelihood of starting a business? What is your guess? Do you expect the same relationship, different relationship?
Unrelated.
Unrelated.
Wouldn't it be
You're being very harsh on entrepreneurs, but
wouldn't it be risk? Entrepreneurs tend to be more risk takers. They're more risk inclined.
sure. But how does it relate to IQ?
Related to
What is your
I
guess?
think it does because some people are.
It's
Fair
unrelated.
enough. That's exactly.
What's the definition of an entrepreneur here?
Whoever starts a new business, registering a business,
Any business.
any business.
So a trade worker, like a tradie, or a construction worker. Starts his own business.
Construction worker,
Okay.
no. But if they are starting construction company with a couple of friends or just that person, then yes, they are an entrepreneur. So you've been very harsh on entrepreneurs, say, but let me be harsher. It's negative. So there is a negative relationship and which was quite puzzling. Then he said, probably we made a mistake somewhere. And then, different people start replicating. We looked at also Finnish data. You just see the same pattern. Indeed, there's this strong relationship, negative relationship between IQ and entrepreneurship. But then we start asking exactly the same questions. What kind of entrepreneurs are we thinking about? Because it's very tempting to think about, Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg's, but at the same time, the street vendors are also entrepreneurs. Mom and pop stores are also entrepreneurs. So a bike repair shop is also an entrepreneur. So entrepreneurship aggregates everything. It's not just these high-tech entrepreneurs. So then what we wanted to do is we want to differentiate between two types of entrepreneurs. And also, let me give you also an important observation. So US economy produced 1.5 million additional businesses during COVID. So business registry numbers annually was 3.5 million. Annually, it went up to 5 million. So during that time, people were very cheerful, saying that, oh, this is great, a lot of dynamism. But do we really think that there were 1.5 million entrepreneurs in the US who were just waiting for the worst time to start a business, where the inflation is highest, cost of borrowing is highest? Clearly not. So then this is clearly some people were desperate to start a business. They lost their job. So out of necessity, they had to start a business, right? So, and many of those businesses didn't create any jobs. They just start a business without hiring. So we need to differentiate between these necessity or subsistence entrepreneurs versus innovative, transformative entrepreneurs. Okay, how can we do that? Our data contains workers and firm level information. I think also, to exploit the strength of our data, what we are going to do is when Catherine starts a business, I need to read Catherine's intention, future goals. If Catherine is just trying to keep a small mom and pop store, probably she's going to hire someone to carry around the boxes, some low skill people. Or if she's planning to grow her business, probably she's going to spend the money and hire some technical people, some R&D workers into her company. So then by looking at whom they're hiring early in their life cycle, we are going to differentiate between transformative entrepreneurs and subsistence. If they hire some technical person early in their life cycle, that's how we are going to label those firms as transformative. If they never hire technical person, we call them subsistence. With this definition now, oh, by the way, one interesting question here is that what predicts entrepreneurship is not IQ, but what predicts entrepreneurship is whether the parents are entrepreneurs or not. If people are born to an entrepreneurial family, they are more likely to end up being entrepreneurs. They are not inheriting companies. We are excluding them. They are starting their own business, and this is very related to family status. Whereas to become an R&D worker or inventor, college education, college and above, and ability, IQ, seems to matter a lot. So now let's look at the subsistence versus transformative entrepreneurs. This is the relationship between IQ and subsistence entrepreneur. Indeed, the majority, 90% of entrepreneurs are subsistence. So that's why the overall trend that I showed earlier was driven by these 90% of subsistence entrepreneurs. What about that handful, 10% transformative entrepreneurs? What is the relationship between the two? You guessed it correctly. So one more guess.
Unrelated.
No, it's very positive. Okay. So it looks like, there's quite a bit of difference between transformative and subsistence entrepreneurs and their likelihood of, starting a business and their IQ level. Now, why do we care about this? Yes, this is some interesting bedtime reading probably, but for policy making, should we be really worried about this? The answer is a very strong yes, because job creation patterns are massively different between these two types of entrepreneurs. When we look at the life cycle of businesses, so this is when they are born, and we normalize the initial size of the firm to 1 just for comparison purposes. Relative to their initial size, the so-called subsistence entrepreneurs are just doubling their size by hiring 1 more person, and then they just stay flat. They don't grow any further. But when you look at that handful transformative entrepreneurs over their life cycle, they keep growing. So these are the job creators. So now, in light of this, how should we think about subsidizing new businesses? Should we give tax break to everybody? Should we give subsidy to everybody or cheap loan to everybody? Or should we target more the job creators if the goal is job creation? Of course, just looking at the micro data, now we can make more informed decision, right? Because it looks like not everybody is trying to do the same thing. Now, if, education seems to be very important for both being an inventor and also being a transformative entrepreneur. These are also learned practices. Ability is not sufficient. We need to also teach them the sophistication, all the details about, being a frontier entrepreneur. Then the question is, who gets educated? And here's the relationship between parental income and education. What we see in this graph is even in the case of Denmark, which is a very egalitarian economy relative to many other economies, even there's a very strong relationship between family resources and the child's likelihood of going to school, going to college. You can imagine the situation in the US, for instance, or other unequal societies. Their access to education is massively different. And if there's this unequal access to education, this means that a lot of talented kids, if they are born to poor families, won't be able to nurture themselves. As a result, won't be able to come to these critical positions and be able to create jobs and create spillovers on the rest of the society. So that's why education is critical, right? We typically think that, or the earlier literature has been focusing more and more on the average years of schooling, but I think it's more the technical training that matters. And we need to think about more of the vertical education policies rather than horizontal education policies, if we want to lead a productivity-driven growth. So in the interest of time, I will, so indeed, for instance, when we do a horse race between alternative policies, so it turns out that our analysis shows that, when it comes to productivity-driven growth, the first policy that needs to be considered is education subsidy, nurturing the talent pool. Then the second important policy is subsidizing innovative startups. Only third in the list is subsidizing incumbents in terms of giving R&D tax credit, for instance. But typically, it's much more common across countries to first, whenever we think about innovation policy, we usually think about giving a tax break to incumbents, whereas this policy says, that's not the right order of policy. So now, let me be very, very quick on the industrial policy as well. So, as I mentioned, different firms, there are different types of firms in the data, but the same firm also starts having different incentives as they grow in size. Okay, so especially when it comes to policy design, the policy making might be influenced by many different forces. So let me show you a very interesting study that we have conducted in Italy. So what we did is we managed to get access to social security records of all the Italian workers. So this means that we can observe everybody in the Italian economy. And we also know which company they are working. And we want to ask a very simple question. So would large firms somehow get, tangled up with the political system? It's very, you read these in the newspaper, but is this really something that's happening systematically? What we did is we took the register of local politicians, mayors, vice mayors, council members in municipalities. We are talking about 500,000 local politicians. We merged this data with the social security records. Since this is a part-time job, being a local politician is a part-time job. They can also work for a company at the same time. That way, now we can see who is on the payroll of a firm, right? The politicians who are on the payroll of a firm. And now let's look at the data. So another question is coming. So now we look at a market, and market here is defined as an industry in a six-digit industry in a given region in a given year. Okay, you take 1 year, one region, and one particular industry. That's our definition of market. And we look at the largest 20 firms in that market. 1 is the market leader. 20 is the smallest among the largest 20 firms. Okay, as we go to the left, market size, firm size increases. Now, my question is, what is the tendency to hire a politician as the firm size increases? No relationship? Now, you all know the answer. They tend to hire disproportionately more politicians. This is intensity, by the way. This is not the likelihood of hiring. This is relative to their size. How many politicians do they hire? They start relying disproportionately more on a politician. This might not be a bad news because maybe these firms are the most innovative firms and they need some politician for new regulation, new infrastructure, etc., that will go with the new technology. So let's look at their innovativeness in that case. What do you think is the relationship between market rank and innovativeness? Yes, you guessed it correctly. It's negative. So when you put the two together, as you can see, the same firm's incentive as they are growing in size is shifting from being more innovative towards more defensive activities. And I'm not concluding this only from this graph. There are many, many other evidences, but this is one of the most interesting and striking graphs that we have come across. Do I have 2-3 more minutes? Okay, so now we like it when firms invest in R&D. That's why we are subsidizing firms, right? We take taxpayers' money, give them the profit-making entities saying that, look, you're not making enough profit. Take more because we want you to invest in R&D. And indeed, these policies were very prevalent in the US economy, and successfully it increased industry R&D relative to GDP over time. So this is business R&D relative to GDP. And over time, it's just kept growing and growing. Indeed, relative to 2000, R&D to GDP ratio almost doubled. There has been a very strong increase in business R&D, which is supposed to be a great thing. And as a result, the economy should be growing in terms of productivity. But instead, this is the historical growth, productivity growth in the US. Post-2000, when there was an explosion in R&D, business R&D, productivity growth has been consistently lower than the historical average. With the exception of with the exception of these 2 years, it has been consistently negative, lower than the historical average. Normally, according to the standard theory or standard intuition, more R&D should make all these bars go above the dashed line. So what's happening? Why do we see this puzzle? So this is the R&D tax credit program, and 1981 was the first time US government introduced R&D tax credit at the federal level. At the state level, Minnesota was the first state to introduce it, and then over time, more and more states introduced. So, and then this is the R&D intensity of the publicly traded companies. They really enjoyed all these policy interventions, and they kept investing more and more in R&D. And R&D investment at the aggregate was great. But who utilized these policies? Who utilized R&D tax credit? R&D tax credit, normally when it's designed, it's typically targeting all the firms, but effectively who is using these programs is typically the largest firm. So on the x-axis here, we look at the firm size. On the y-axis, we are looking at the likelihood of utilizing that program. And as you can see, large firms are using this program disproportionately more. And there are many, many reasons why that's the case. It's not necessarily the aim of the program potentially, but ultimately that's what it ends up doing. So is this necessarily a bad thing? Let's look at the numbers. This is showing the fraction of inventors who are producing patents, who are producing technologies that are working for incumbents. How do we define incumbents? Incumbents are defined as those firms that have more than 1,000 employees, plus they are older than 20 years. These are really incumbents, basically. And these incumbents used to have 48% of inventors in early 2000s, but when there was this R&D boom, they went up to 58%, a 10 percentage point increase. So there was a massive reallocation of innovative resources towards large incumbents. Is this good or bad? You have to check. So this is in economics, we like to call it an event study, which is you look at a worker who changes the job, who changes the employer. At time zero, in year zero, here this is a normalization. In year zero, a worker is moving to a large incumbent relative to a non-incumbent firm. Okay, that's the exercise at time zero. And then we are looking at two things. First, after moving to a large incumbent, what happens to the compensation of the same individual? And what we see is that on average, after moving to a large incumbent, the same inventor earns 12% more on average. Superstars go up to 45%. So there's a very significant increase in the compensation. Well, maybe this is because we are having better resource reallocation, and maybe this same inventor is becoming more innovative in a large company. So that's why the person is being compensated. Let's look at the innovativeness of the same person. On average, after moving to a large incumbent, the same person on average experiences 6% drop in the innovativeness. So the person is being compensated 12% more, but experiences a 6% drop in innovativeness. And of course, there are also strategic considerations here. If, for instance, Elvira and I, we are competing and she has some fantastic engineers that's working in her company, that's a threat for me. If I manage to hire those engineers, then the sheer effect that that engineer is not working in my competitor anymore is already giving me an advantage. Even if this inventor stays silent, that's a plus for me. So that's why, there are all these strategic considerations too when it comes to competition that we can identify only looking at the micro data. Okay, so that's why, I think it's important to see the impact of these policies. And, again, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time. So that's why I'm not able to go into all details. But what we have observed since 1980, but more so post 2000, is just rise in market concentration and decline in dynamism. And this corresponds to a period where R&D was exploding. So this is market concentration, just goes up. Market leaders are having a bigger and bigger share. This is average markup, which is price over marginal cost. If the markets are competitive, prices will come down. But if the markets lose their competitiveness, price will go up relative to the cost. And we see the prices are rising relative to the marginal cost. New firm creation, the creation, right? We had these three forces: firm entry rate, new entrepreneurship rate. It used to be 14%, came down to 7% during that time. So a loss in business dynamism. Job reallocation, right? I told you about, resource reallocation, responsiveness to shocks. Job reallocation has decreased during that time. And the very first notion that I started my talk with, which was responsiveness to shocks, right? The correlation between hiring rate and the productivity increase at the firm level, it was high, but then it started to come down exactly during the time when the business R&D was exploding. So that's why more is not necessarily better, right? So rather than just looking at the aggregate numbers, we need to also look at the composition, because not every firm is the same, not every individual is the same. Even the same firm over time might change its strategy if they start dominating. Typically, sometimes I hear the argument that, well, large firms are large because they've been very successful. True, but that doesn't mean that they will keep innovating, right? Maybe after reaching a certain size, they will start defending themselves by simply building a patent thicket around themselves, for instance, and investing their R&D dollars into more defensive activities rather than pushing the frontier. So in short, I think, the key message here is that, of course, every economy has its own story. Here I showed you some examples and try to share with you some of the intuitions that we developed over time. But, coming up with one size fits all type of policies is very, very hard, because, some frictions might be more prevalent in certain economies than others. Indeed, when we study different economies, we see that they are almost like fingerprints. They have all their unique peculiarities. So that's why it is really critical to do the MRI scan for each different economy. And that's possible only when, we have access to microdata, and when policymakers and academics are coming together and analyzing the symptoms together and coming up with right policy recommendations. So thank you so much for listening to me. Thanks.
I have a nagging feeling that I made a mistake when I told you to keep on going for another 3 minutes, because your story got sadder and sadder as it went through. I mean, the bottom line is the first half is that some people are really innovative, isn't that fabulous? And you can identify who they are. The second half is that, and then all the rents get captured by big firms and all the innovation just gets crunched and there's no productivity. So that's a real contrast as to how we go. Anyway, let's run for about 10 minutes or so in questions before we have the story here. Please start here. Just keep the questions really short so we can get as many questions as possible, and I'll pick up the online people as well who've been very patient.
I'm just wondering on that political paradox. Big firms hiring more politicians. Is that indicating some kind of a regulatory capture?
I'm going to repeat the question just to make sure the online people. So the question is regulatory capture coming through here? And then that's explaining how the politicians get involved in these successful companies.
It could be the case. What we did is we tried to look at whether this is more prevalent in more regulated industries. And the answer is yes. So there's a strong correlation between the intensity of relying on politicians and how regulated the markets are. There, we also done some interesting work. I don't have time to go into details, but using newspaper articles now, AI and machine learning, all these things are making this type of research possible. By doing, textual analysis, we identified which industries are more regulated on average. And indeed, there was a strong correlation between, hiring politicians and regulated markets. Indeed, when there's no regulation, there's not much need for relying on political system.
Yes.
Hi, Professor. You mentioned that subsidizing young firms is more efficient. It reminds me of Eric Starm's policy idea of backing challenges rather than picking winners. But it's very hard to implement in real life. So have you seen any policymakers try to do it or run experiments?
So I don't want to necessarily, say that in every economy we should be subsidizing young firms. I'm more supportive of the idea that we should be supporting dynamic firms. And, for instance, it's, there might be different ways of identifying it. Let me give you one example. In the case of we looked at some countries that implemented credit guarantee. It's a program, that supports firm borrowing ability because banks are typically worried from lending. And then, the government comes and says, hey, if they default, I'm going to cover it up. So in that case, the banks are more generous in extending it. And then we did a simple impact analysis. We divide the group of firms into 5 bins: micro firm, small firm, medium firm, large, very large. Any idea which firms reacted most? It wasn't the micro, it wasn't the small, which are typically also young, right? It was primarily the mid-sized firms that reacted most. Why? Because micro and small firms, there are a lot of subsistence entrepreneurs. And then there's a small group of firms that are trying to grow, but they are typically growing with their own resources, and then they run out of gas. And that's exactly where they are really dependent on external resources. And if the banking or the financial markets don't extend the loan, in that case, they run out of gas. Even though they are transformative, they want to make a difference. That's exactly where the society is losing, from some promising firms' capability. In an environment like this, I would be focusing, for instance, on that group of firms that are going to challenge the market leaders and make the markets more competitive. But by simply eliminating them from financial markets, we are suppressing competition. So that's one policy that worked well, for instance, at the time. Another interesting policy that we saw working well was the Gazelle program in France. In France, the government said that if the firms are growing more than 15% for 2 consecutive years, only in the 3rd year we will give tax exemption. That's, again, supporting some dynamism, right? So there are different ways. So I don't want to just condition myself and come to you and say, hey, we should always support the young businesses. No. In that case, I might not be speaking to these firms. So every economy has its own story. So that's why it's really critical to identify where the heartbeat is and ideally go and behind those firms and support them.
Other questions? Please.
Like you mentioned that there's like a lot of defensive behavior done by the larger firms. In realistic, through policy, how would you stop that defensive behavior? Because it's sort of a natural capitalistic.
Sure. I mean, we cannot, they can spend money on whatever they want. But what the policymakers can do as a mistake is to also extend them additional resources to defend themselves. That would be the mistake. So, for instance, in what I showed you, even though these firms are doing incremental innovations, they are just buying small startups to put them asleep, doing killer acquisitions, etc. Many policies are giving them more resources, which then later on use to kill competition. At least, a good policy move would be not to do this, right? So rather than, having to chase them and trying to punish them, what we can do is first, recognize that these type of things are also possible in the data in the real world and reevaluate the policies that we are implementing. So of course, all these policies are, well intended, but we shouldn't be naive when it comes to policymaking, right? Because there's a lot of strategic behavior that's happening.
But isn't the essence of the question that's raised, and really much of what you're saying, that in a democracy, big firms are going to try and capture the government, and governments are going to be very receptive to that. So there's a question here that a non-economist could, I think, definitely come back to us, and it's a legitimate question saying, what's the point of your economic model if indeed it's fine when you get all the innovators, but if we know the reality is that then the large companies are going to capture the government, destroy competition and whatever, what is the point of saying your model's even legitimate? And I mean, much of the public dialogue against economics, broadly speaking, comes down to that kind of an idea. I've rephrased it in a different way. But how do we counter that?
That's a very good question. So there are 2 separate issues, right? One of them is just the naive naive fact that even Joseph Schumpeter at the time mentioned the fact that when I'm new to the market, I will do everything to prove myself. I remember when I was a young assistant professor, I was sleeping very little. Even now I'm sleeping little, but for a different reason. So I'm traveling more. But when companies are early in their life cycle, they have every incentive to prove themselves to the market. So that's why they are taking more risk. They do more innovative stuff. Later on, once they start dominating the market, now they try to patent every extension to their crown technology so that it's harder to leapfrog them. So this is also a changing behavior, acting more defensively, and there's nothing to punish there, right? This is more than naive or more positive slowdown on the business side. Whereas there's also the more strategic element, which is, what you just highlighted. The capture is a real threat in many economies, especially if the institutions are not strong enough. Then, and we see this repeatedly typically in developing countries. And that's a different story. And of course, in that case, we should move away from these more naive models where we don't look into the political economy aspect of things, but we need to also start thinking about how, how we should strengthen the democracy. And that's why, three folks this year won the Nobel Prize, right, for arguing that indeed this threat of weak institutions is a real cost on the economies, and that's why we need to worry more about how we can make the governments more protected from being captured. Unfortunately, what we are seeing around is not going in the expected direction. But this is a discussion of democracy and how to implement and how to strengthen the institutions, which at least this line of work will not speak to that yet, and there it's a broader conversation for us to have.
I think that the issue that you've discussed, and it's a nice response, but it's not really just developing in emerging economies. I think it's very relevant for advanced economies.
I didn't want to say it, David.
Well, I'm happy to say it. Thank you very much, Professor. That was just a fantastic portrayal of all of these issues. The way you brought them together into such a nice story was amazing. I don't know how you did it without any equations as well. I've never seen that done before. But that's very impressive. Can we give a round of applause?